I think if you look at a lot of churches, they're going to say, hey, there's specific ways that we approach poverty. We're going to look at the structural issues, or we're going to look at forming people at an individual level. So I wonder if you would if you had a word to communities that maybe strongly lean one way or the other, that either leave structural questions out of the picture or our responsibility as individuals, what you might say to communities like that.
Well, for me, I think both arguments about individual level behaviors leading to poverty and arguments about structural conditions leading to poverty are more similar in one respect than we often think, which is they're pretty absolving. They kind of get us off the hook. The issue either is, someone who's making a mistake, in life, or the issue is history or structure, and like good luck explaining what structure is, to your friend in Thanksgiving. It's like, what does that even mean? And so I think that it's kind of this strange story that we've told ourselves that like there's this a ton of people that aren't able to meet their basic needs. And it's kind of like doesn't involve us. We're not part of that story. So, Tolstoy raised this at the end of his career. He moves to Moscow. He sees all this poverty in Moscow that just hits him really hard. And he's like, what is the cause of this? And he does all these fascinating things. He joins the census so he can talk to people. He adopts a kid. The kid runs away. And then finally he kind of just faces the fact that it's on me. I'm part of this. I'm embroiled in this. And we could talk about this specifically. Like, for example, we often kind of look at the housing crisis and we say, gosh, this is a really unfortunate crisis. And the landlords or the corporate landlords are really benefiting from this. And that's a really important conversation. But another important conversation is to be like, look, aren't homeowners benefiting from this sometimes? Don't we collectively act to make housing really scarce and expensive because that props up our property values? Or, isn't it true that, when my retirement count goes up and up and up like magic, that sometimes that comes at a human cost, borne by the working poor. I'm connected to their lives in ways. And so I think that for me, kind of, walking away or kind of splitting the difference between those two, poles that are often associated with a conservative take or a liberal stake, and often asking, look, can we kind of face the fact that some lives are made small so that others may grow? And face the fact that a lot of us don't want to have that, don't like that arrangement. I think that gets us to a more productive and honest place than often the debate currently is set.
Yeah, just on the structural piece, the piece I spent the last several months working on the diploma divide. I mean, it's an example of where some of us, like, we invest in those of us who have means, invest in our kids. There's a guy at Yale named Daniel Markovits who calculates that the average college-educated family invests over the course of the child the equivalent of about $10 million per kid.
Hmm.
Good private school tuition, oboe practice, hockey practice, trips to museums, trips to Europe. And that's just a massive investment. And so it should be no surprise that when you go to an elite school, that you'll have often more students from the top 1% of earners than the bottom 60%. And we have this weird system where we take the people who are privileged and we invest more massively in them. So if you go to an Ivy League school, the amount of money that school is spending on you is somewhere in the ranks of $350,000 a year. And that's for the rich kids. And then if you don't go to that kind of school and you go to a community college, well, we're spending about $11,000 on you. So it's this weird system where we spend more on the privilege than on everybody else. And so we're all implicit in this system. And so how do you think about how can we change that? And that just takes fundamental systemic change. The part I focus on and weave is a little less that and more at the local level. And so I've learned through Weave, and I don't know if Matt will agree with me, but that the neighborhood is the unit of change. That, as a friend of mine says, you can't only clean the part of the swimming pool you're swimming in. You got to clean the pool. And so when we don't want to have systems, in my view, that pluck certain talented kids out of neighborhoods and send them off places and they don't come back and the neighborhood is left. And so we want to clean the whole neighborhood. And so, for example, just to say Raj Chetty again, He did a study on two neighborhoods in LA, Compton and Watts. And Compton had way higher social mobility than Watts. Compton had way lower incarceration rates than Watts, even though these two neighborhoods are demographically very similar and maybe 3 miles apart from each other. So what's the deal? And so I spent weeks in Compton and Watts, and my conclusion was Compton is an actual city within LA, and Watts is just a neighborhood. So it has way more civic structures, and then there are many more places to go in Compton. So if you're a kid, there's many more nonprofits who are there, so you can go do homework, whatever. Uh, and I met a woman in Watts who runs a little program called Sisters of Watts, who just takes kids who need food. She gives them backpacks full of food to take home, that sort of thing. And she says in Watts, the foundations come in for 3 years. They get a grant. The grant runs out, and they leave, and they never talk to us. And so the other thing I've learned in this work is that the neighborhood knows what it needs. And so if you empower the neighborhood knows what it needs. It doesn't always have the resources, but it has the expertise and it has the trusted messengers. And so I think a little about systems, but mostly I'm thinking about the local neighborhood system to see if it's the kind of place where people are able to support one another. And I have to say, and this would be interesting, I was a flaming socialist in college and in high school. You can go on YouTube and if you debate.
Thanks for watching this Theology Lab video. If you're enjoying it, you can subscribe to the channel below and you'll get more Theology Lab videos as soon as they're released.
If you Google your YouTube, David Brooks, Milton Friedman, you'll see me as a socialist debating with Milton Friedman on TV and getting destroyed, by the way. And this, one of the things that shifted me right, I became a police reporter after college. And I'm covering places like the Robert Taylor homes and Cabrini Green, which are projects in Chicago. And well-meaning social planners looked at these old, what had been wooden, rickety neighborhoods, and they say, let's help these people. Let's tear down those wooden, rickety neighborhoods, and let's put up high rises. And when they tore down the rickety neighborhoods, they never asked the people in the neighborhoods, as usual. And then but they tore out the systems of support that were in those neighborhoods. And by the time I got there as a reporter, Cabrini Green and Robert Taylor homes were horrible places, run by gangs, etc. And fortunately now they've been torn down. But that's the importance of having, aside from the big systemic things, having mutual support systems at the local level.
Oh, so I can't just leave that hanging. The neighborhood is the unit of change. Matt, just want to give you an opportunity to comment on that if you want.
I mean, there's a lot of data to back that up. And I think that, one way I'm thinking about this is, when we have this conversation, we're often focused on material poverty, but there's also the spiritual poverty that's gripping the country, especially in affluent communities. And so one of the things that I often ask my audiences is like, how's your kind of scared affluence working out for you? And I think there's a lot of folks that are very secure and comfortable in their money and feel completely lonely and isolated and disconnected from other folks. And in that fear of like really trying to protect your property values, making sure like only kids that, have professional parents can go to this public school, those kind of things. We create these systems, these downstream systems for other neighborhoods that are really crunched. So the conversation about gentrification kind of drives me a little nuts because, you have this conversation that's basically like pitting folks that really could use housing against folks that are just barely hanging on to their housing. And should we gentrify? Should we not? Should we build? Should we not? And the only reason we're having that conversation like that is because these neighborhoods over here, these wealthy, affluent neighborhoods have been so successful at keeping out any kind of affordable housing. So, when I think of Washington, D.C., for example, I don't think of gentrification just being a place that's affecting the U Street corridor. I'm also thinking about Georgetown, about how those homeowners have been so good at keeping folks out. So I think this is a way to think about neighborhoods is in this connected system and how like opening up those neighborhoods. Look, it's not going to be all like sunshine and butterflies. It's going to be really a really hard thing to do, I think, and awkward, and it's going to be scary for a lot of folks. But I think opening up those neighborhoods not only asks us to aspire to higher values, it also gives an opportunity for something that David's talking about to form that deeper kind of social fabric in communities.